And we are live with another Freedom Friday. Welcome to Freedom and welcome to Friday, both at the same time. Get ready, people. This is going to be a great show. Sharif El-Mekki, educator, myth, legend. How you doing today, brother?
Doing well, man. Doing well. I hear my daughter up there practicing her phonics in Freedom Schools. I'm down here with Freedom Fridays, and it's all about this. We're liberated and not yet free, but we're going to fight to get it.
And we're going to do it through education, right?
Yeah. Hey, use it. That shirt, I love it. I'll be sporting it all over the place. The revolution will be literate.
It will be literate. Anybody wants to buy the revolution will be literate t-shirt, let me know. We'll put the link into the comments so that you can go and get that shirt. We should almost make it a uniform.
I was about to say, don't even wait for them that. Just put that link in there. Folks you need this shirt. You need the message, and we need to live this message. That's right. It is paramount.
So this is what we're talking about today. For the people that are listening and watching and joining in here, let's just start with this fact. Freedom Fridays, like my show every day, is a community. It is not about us teaching anything necessarily. It's about a communal activity for us to join together and learn at the same time. So as you are watching and participating today, if you have resources that you think add to the conversation, if you have insights, comments, questions, whatever, put them in the comment section so that we can look at them and it can help make the discussion better, more informed, and we can learn together at the same time, which is one of the main strategies of Black education throughout all of history anyways. Today, we are talking about the unique and special place that Washington, D.C., the African-American people, the Black people, the Negroes, as they were once called, the colored folks of Washington, D.C., play such a pivotal role in what we consider, what we take for granted, once called the colored, as Black education today. So we're going to talk a little bit about some things in history, maybe do a quick rundown of the history. I'll give a little bit of a setup here, and then we can just dive right in. So first, let it be said that Washington, D.C. was a special case when it comes to Black history because there's a lot of firsts there, and a lot of the strategy that we take for granted now in civil rights, the fight for civil rights in the United States came from Black folks educated in Washington, D.C. It came out of Washington, D.C. schools. As I started to look and prep for this show today, I found a few things that I just want to say at the top. First of all, the civil rights litigation strategy that we know so well through things like Brown versus Board of Education, but challenges in Texas and elsewhere, that the initial challenges throughout the country to things like unequal resources and segregation and all of those kind of oppressive legal apparatuses. The strategy for attacking that came out of Black people educated in Washington, D.C. The early DCers were really, this is going to become important in this conversation, they wanted autonomous Black leaderships and inequality of resources. Their initial fight was not for, their initial fight was not for integration and the breaking down of Black schools because they felt as though autonomous Black leadership was key to the success of education. What they really wanted was an equality of resources. Mm-hmm. The history of Black Washingtonians, I think you would call it, is one. It's a history of irony. Segregated schools, for instance, segregated Black schools in DC had a hothouse effect. It was supposed to be something made of oppression, which it was, and white supremacy, or as Sharif would call it, white savagery. But what actually happened was a hothouse flower effect. which was something made in segregation and made out of oppression that was meant to put us down, actually created an effect where you had some of our brightest and most talented and most gifted, most educated people teaching in schools for Black students. And because of that, those Black students rose like flowers. So the idea that the cliche of they tried to bury us, but they didn't know that we were seeds.
Yep.
Actually, that is the story of Black education in DC. They tried to bury us, and they didn't know that they were seeds, that we were seeds. A lot that comes out of DC defeats the idea that white ice is colder and white water is wetter, because actually DC tells us that a lot of Black educational institutions weren't just good, they were superior to anything built anywhere else. What the people there fought for was educational capital. They wanted to build educational capital. They weren't trying to give their capital away. They wanted to build infrastructure and governance and autonomous Black leadership of schools. And they were in partnership with whites, Northern whites, investors, and today, people who today would be called, derided as white saviors. Those were their main partners in developing school systems. I'll end by saying this. People like Charles Houston came out of the segregated, so-called segregated superior schools of Washington, D.C., but he's not alone. Charles Houston was the architect of the NAACP's dismantling of segregation legally. His initial take on it was not to go for integration as the thing. His initial fight was for an equalization strategy, meaning that he wanted there to be autonomous Black schools that got the full resources that the white schools got. And that was for many reasons that we might get into today. But there's the setup. The first schools in the United States serving Black students were private. They were established by Black people, some who could and could not read. Between 1800 and 1861, Black people started schools in Washington, D.C. They paid their own teachers, and their big fight then was that they were being taxed by government, but they weren't being provided the resources for their schools. From then on, from there forward, 1800 until today, there is a story to tell about the superior education system that Blacks built in Washington, D.C. My final word on it is, but also was destroyed by. Sharif, tell me what you think I'm going to say that it was destroyed by.
Well, probably if I look at the history, it was destroyed by the takeover of Black unions. It was destroyed by the public system that they had established.
And desegregation.
Yep.
Yeah. Like that's the irony. The irony is something that was built out of an oppressive regime of segregation actually had the unintended consequence of creating Black excellence and Black ownership over the process. And the thing that was meant to save us, the thing that the talented 10th brought us, which was integration as the main legal strategy, is the thing that destroyed Black educational capital, starting in Washington, D.C. Fight me, anybody in the comments, if you think that that's the wrong story, but let's hear it. So Sharif El-Mekki, brother, what do you say? Jump in here. That's the setup.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic setup. And it gives, there's so many topics that you brought up that are not only relevant today, but it's always been relevant and should be part of the blueprint. So one, just that idea of taxation without representation. And I would just wonder, like, how many Black people, particularly folks who don't have a ton of resources, how many of them would say that their taxes, that they're feeling represented, and particularly in the educational sphere, political sphere, yes, all of it, but particularly in your taxes, do you think that it's being invested in your children in the way, right? So while DC is in this fight of statehood, we're in a fight for citizenship that has not ended. It is never ended, right? And as Malcolm said, you don't have to keep passing laws to protect people if they're actually citizens, right? And so we have to keep fighting for what we deserve as human beings, what our children deserve as human beings. And I think DC plays just a crucial role, and it was really fascinating to read about these these folks and the alliances that were built, right? Particularly Northern whites, Quakers, Black folks. And as you said, some were illiterate, when you think about like the Bell School and right, like in these, 6 years out of slavery, George Bell, his wife, first of all, his wife purchased his freedom by selling vegetables and cleaning and all of that, purchased his freedom. And 6 years later, he was 40 years old when she was able to, purchase his freedom. 6 years later, he's banding together. He was a carpenter. He was a skilled carpenter. He banded together with two other Black men, all illiterate, and they hired this white guy, Lowe, to come teach. They're like, yo, we're building a school. We're going to hire you to teach, right? Like, and that is so much just packed into that that one little story. And we know this was happening all around the country, but DC is ground zero, man, in so many ways.
So George Bell, who you just mentioned, came together with Nicholas Franklin and Moses Liverpool. They formed the first school in 1807 called the Bell School, after G. Bell, who couldn't read or couldn't write, but he established the first school with the express purpose of serving Black students in Washington, D.C. I mean, there's so much to unpack about that story, too.
Yeah,
Number one, you don't have to be highfalutin to start a school or to contribute to the education of your people. Today, we allow so many things to prevent us from doing something big because we don't have the fill in the blank with something that you really don't need, right? And then we look at stories like this from history, and we figure out that people did way more with less.
Way more with less. And just think, when you're released from bondage, it's like that. For him to have that folk, you hear a lot of people, so many of our people are like incarcerated, they get out and you hear them talking about like, first thing I'm going to do. Their first thing was, we're going to educate Black children. Imagine,
and we're going to pay for it ourselves too. That's the funny thing.
Yeah.
The second school, Black school, was established by Association of Free Black People in the city of Washington, D.C. It was called the Resolute Beneficial Society. It was meant to improve the intellect and morals of colored youth, for they would be interested in reading, writing, arithmetic, English grammar, and such subjects as they could master. Their second teacher, because you mentioned the first white guy who taught there, the first Black teacher was a shoemaker named John Adams. He was the first Black man to teach in Washington, D.C. And from there, things grew. So that would have been 1821 that he would have been teaching at the second Black school by the Resolute Beneficial Society. So get this now. So an enslaved person with two other people starts the first school. The free Negroes of DC start another, the second. And by the way, DC had more than its fair share of free Black people at that time. So that's one of the stories here, is that there was a mix between enslaved people or formerly enslaved people and free people in DC who started building their own social capital. By 1867, you have many investors from the North, the Quakers, New England Society, American Missionary, Philadelphia Friends from your home state there, people coming down to DC. You had Baptists, the African Civilization Society, American Free Baptist Mission. You had a mix of white and Black religious people and investors. I'll call them investors. Who were bringing aid to start a burgeoning Black education system in Washington, D.C. And part of that also came from the Freedmen's Bureau when that eventually started kicking out dollars. And D.C. was, I think, the testing ground for the country. The one special thing I want to say about D.C. that we should highlight in history is the federal government D.C. was like their experiment zone. Right. And the states were supposed to learn lessons from what the federal government was doing in DC. I don't know if we can say that it's still that way today. You mentioned you saw some stuff from Allison Stewart. She's a journalist. What'd you get what'd you get from her?
One that, when you look at particularly the Dunbar School, Paul Laurence Dunbar School, and just how pivotal it was. And you mentioned like that segregation, and we're not like celebrating racial segregation. I think people get confused sometimes. As soon as you say like, oh, all black, they're like, oh my gosh, you're the. When the state says like we will lock you up if you try to drink from that fountain, or we will lock you up if you cross the street or walk during the street at this particular time in this particular neighborhood, which they still do. You can still get locked up, if you're black driving in white neighborhoods. But I digress. This school was such an attractant in how she described it. Both of her parents, both of Allison Stewart, the author of this book, First Class, attended Dunbar, and so she's collecting all these stories from graduates and like just the pride that they had. And the first 4 PhDs in this country, black PhDs, were 2 of them attended Dunbar, and 2 of them taught at Dunbar.
Actually, 3 of them came back and taught at Dunbar. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you're talking about like the quality of education in this all black school, something that people are out there saying like it's impossible to have quality education in all black space, which is such digested self-hatred and distortion of actual history, black history, American history, world history, right? It's such a distortion of what we know to be true, what we know to be fact.
I mean, the thing about Dunbar that we have to rescue as a lesson, you just hit on it, and there's, I think, 1 or 2 other things to add to it. The first one is, at a time where you could make all the excuses that we have today, you had an oppressive society, a segregated society. We didn't have all of our rights. Just keep going down the list. People were poor. There was poverty. There was all these things going on. And yet you developed a superior school. How did that happen? At a time when you could have wrote off people of color for all the things that they didn't have the way that we do today. Like, you can't expect schools to do miracles. The kids are poor and the kids are hungry and the kids are this, and it's an oppressive country. So we can't expect teachers to do miracles. But in this case, you're pointing out that superior teachers with PhDs, were able to craft educational environments in one of the worst times in American history that didn't just turn out great students. The thing that is amazing to me about Dunbar is Dunbar turned out more than its fair share of people that changed the country, right? Yes. Like Charles Houston comes out of Dunbar. Charles Houston created something in terms of legal strategy that impacted the entire country, not just Washington, D.C. And he's not alone. You find other people. The first presidential cabinet member comes out of that school. The first black graduate of the Naval Academy comes out of that school. You have jazz musicians who come to prominence out of that school. This is really important for us to rescue right now.
It's extremely important. And as I was reading this book, one of the things that it highlighted that I you hear now, because you had on Twitter, like, why are folks, or maybe it was one of your previous shows, of why are people fighting the turnaround of this school or the reconstruction of this school and stuff. You hear, so you think of it like Dunbar and like this Hall of Fame graduates, and then you hear about other folks that are just like, yo, we got great basketball players here. We got great, athletic program here. How's the literacy? Yo, we got, you want to see the gym? Hey, what's your, how do you teach read? You want to see the gym? So that, and then the other thing that's really pernicious, you'll hear from people, our people as well, was like those PhDs only did that because they had no other choice. And what they imply is that no intelligent, brilliant, accomplished Black person wants to work with Black children. Like, that is the epitome of, idiotic thinking, right? Like, yes, you can have two truths. Yes, the options were limited, and folks were going back to say, oh, we're going to raise that next generation. You know what? Our people, help is on the way, and they're sitting, there was this one revolutionary, they were mocking him. He was being arrested, exiled, and they asked him, where's your army now? You're talking all that rhetoric. Where's your people now? He's like, they're in the laps of their mothers. right? He's saying like that's what's it. And another version of it said they're in the wombs of their mothers, right? Like that foresight thinking. Those are the type of folks that we need in schools, adjacent to schools, in our communities, right? Like understanding that, we got work to do, and help for our people is on the way.
I mean, you're hitting on something that becomes a contemporary issue that we find in that story back then, is that teacher quality matters.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Absolutely.
Fundamentally, doesn't matter what condition the kids are in, teacher quality matters. So if you are today saying things like teachers have very little to do with the outcomes of kids because of home life and because of all the things that kids are experiencing, that's not true in Black education. So we shouldn't take other people's dictates about what will and won't work for us when our own history tells us that they're lying to us half the time, right? Yeah. What Allison Stewart says about Dunbar is what ended up happening is that African Americans, the first African Americans to go to competitive colleges like Oberlin, Amherst, Brown, Harvard, they would graduate from school and have nowhere else to go. So she's hitting on the thing that you just said. Many of them came back to teach at this high school. My mom and dad went to this high school in the 1940s. They had a very different experience. My mother was born and raised in Washington, D.C. My dad was born and raised in Harlem. My grandmother picked him up at 14, took him to D.C. just to go to Dunbar.
That's amazing, right? Like
moved from Harlem to D.C. just to go
for education, right? The lengths we will go for education, right? And we still see that, right? We see families move into different neighborhoods. You know, this uplift, this idea of racial uplift can't be separated from education, quality education. You know, we will use aunt, uncles, whoever's addresses. We will try to open up charter schools. We will try to get scholarships for private schools, like, you know, but there's also this narrative. So we know in reality, that's what's happening. Then there's also this reality of this narrative that's just evil, that, you know, oh, Black people don't care about education. We actually, you know, and we read this in, for those who were in the 8 Black Hands book club, led by Dr. Cole, with Education of Blacks in the South. We saw this. We also see it in the story of Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. So while Black people were starting schools, you know, and then particularly even after, as it was the Civil War, after the Civil War, white folks were saying, don't go to these. They were at least telling their peers, which a lot of times when they're telling wealthy white folks, that trickles down. And sometimes Black folks who want to, you know, get to the whatever they believe top of the mountain, a lot of times it's financial. And in those kind of circles, they started listening like, yeah, well, the white folks not sitting. White folks were saying, public schools are like public bathrooms. Don't use them. Just like like you wouldn't go to a public bathroom. Don't go to a public school. That's the, you know, the worst of society. But you have Black people who are like, oh no, we're building schools for our children. Those 3 illiterate men and Bell's wife, they are like, we're going to build schools. When we talked about a long time ago, that woman in the South who was at that meeting and said, I have a single copper penny and it is for the education of Black children, right? Like that was our mindset. And that's the mindset that we should continue to nurture, protect, and build upon, not this other stuff.
Yeah, I think that we lose a lot by not looking back to these stories and thinking through the implications that they have for us today, because we are living in the belief gap right now. Like the narrative that existed back then was you have to do everything you possibly can. You have to do it for yourself. You have to get your best of your best together. You have to, you know, have them creating a way where there is no way for our youth, because your freedom is tied to doing that. Today, what we have is we have a professional class of people who benefit from the belief gap, who benefit from making it seem like it's impossible to educate Black children. You know, so that way they don't have to be accountable for any results, and they get to keep their jobs and their pensions, right? They get to keep their political power, their standing, their middle-class lifestyles without ever being on the hook for results, because they live beneath this umbrella of the belief gap. If they can make you believe the narrative that Black children can't learn because they're hungry, that the condition and the status of Black children is so bad right now in 2020 versus what it was in 1901 and 1801, that they just can't possibly be educated, that their brains aren't elastic, that they're not actually, even though they're hungry sometimes and they have certain things going on, in their lives, that their brains are still elastic. It's not as if they've stopped learning. They actually are learning every day, all day long, even when they're not in your care. Right? You can't stop kids from learning. They're learning. They're just not learning from you, not you, Sharif. Because I'm sure they were learning from you.
Listen, I think it's the nuance of that, of what they're learning. Sometimes what they're learning in just is like, you know what, I'm not worthy of education because I'm not receiving it, so I must not be worthy. And I'm in front of people who say, I love public education. I love you all. I love y'all so much. Even though I didn't spend any time on the lesson plan. I'm not going to PDs. I'm not doing that, but I love y'all so much. Right? What does a child internalize from that over the years if they say like, wait a minute, you love me and that you didn't teach me anything, right? And so at some point, how many children start believing like, one, I don't belong here, this must not be for me, and then two, I must not be worthy of the absolute best, because I can see, I used to tell my folks, any student of mine who competes in any kind of way sees automatically what society thinks about them. Because anytime they go to any other school, in the suburbs, in other cities, and they see like how that school is, how new it is, how many resources it has, and then they come back to West Philadelphia and they're like, wait a minute, this is obviously two different countries.
And we think that they don't pick up on that.
Oh man, it's like glaring. Like they would talk about it all the way, and I would talk about it as a kid coming back. Right, we go to a football game, a track meet, a science competition. A lot of the conversation coming back, like, did you see that? Like, why is it? And this was before we understood the property tax thing. It was just outright like, they hate us. Like they got that. We got this. So the property tax also shows that they hate us. But in the 14-year-old language, it was just like, that's crazy.
That makes me think of a story that came out of looking into DC, the strategy between equalization versus integration as strategies for what Black folks should push for. So you mentioned you have Black students who are leaving the cities at times and playing football games in suburban schools, and they're looking at what the suburban schools have, for instance. And sometimes those suburban schools are even recruiting people from the city to play on their football teams to come back and beat the kids that don't have as many resources. And the kids are picking up when they're out there, they're seeing the difference. They're like, man, y'all got all of this, huh? That's interesting. Whatnot. Our kids aren't stupid. They know what that means.
And not far, right? We're talking about like within a mile, within 2 miles.
Get right outside the city limits in some cases, right? Just the first ring suburbs. And they can see the difference. Now, if my friend, former Teacher of the Year, Leanne Stevens, is watching this, I visited one of her groups at an integrated high school. She ran a group for the kids of color that were coming to that school, and they were living on a little academic island internally because it wasn't necessarily hospitable for them there. But I asked them, how do you feel about this coming to the school and, having access to all this stuff and whatnot? And what they said to me to a one was, I love it. I love all the stuff that we have here. I actually wish it was in the schools closer to home so I could go to school with my people. Right. And that was blowing me away, because what they were basically saying was, this is great. I love it here. I actually don't feel 100% comfortable. They make sure that I don't feel 100% comfortable. And if I could have all of this
full-time job, right?
Right. That's exactly. It was someone's full-time job to help take care of them.
No, and also to make them feel uncomfortable.
Well, true. That's the whole school's job, to make them feel that. But they were basically saying, if I could have all of this in my schools, which is now the difference in that is that's the difference between equalization and integration. If they could have had neighborhood schools with their own people, where they felt that they were being taught by people who believed in them and people who looked like them and who felt familiar to them in a way, they would take that over being bussed across the city or into another city, going to someone else's home turf and having access to all of this stuff, but not having access to their own people. And in DC, that was what was at issue, I think, in the early strategies was Black folks wanted control of their own schools. It wasn't a strategy. What they wanted was equal resources. And we've said this a million times about Brown being an excursion from what Black people were actually wanting. They didn't just want it just because they thought it was a nice to have. And they definitely didn't want it because they thought that segregation was good. They wanted it because they thought that turning their kids over to anyone else would be an error in strategy. They thought their strategy for building power was to run your own. They wanted their own superintendent, which they got. They fought for and got their own superintendent. They wanted their own school board, which they fought and they got. They wanted a Black school board. They wanted control over the Black teachers and the Black schools. What they wanted, though, were buildings, resources, adequate inputs to make it all work. Somewhere along the line, I got to think about how I'm going to say this. The lighter skinned of the crew started deciding that whitewater was wetter and that the strategy in collaboration with some of their white benefactors should not be to have autonomous, empowered Black schools and as a strategy, and Black education apparatus as the strategy. It should be to give all that up and to integrate into the white schools. That comes later, but I just wanted to point out that as of even today, when you have Black kids that go to schools for like sports games or whatever, they see the difference between the two. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they want to go to those schools. It means that they know for a fact they're not getting an equal input to what those schools are giving their kids.
Exactly. And they, and that, that understanding, a child understands that and they're in the situation. But then we have the, those who are educated, like Dr. Clark says, a whole lot of folks with college degrees, but they're not educated, right? Like they have a very different understanding, or, I don't know if it's, revisionist history or, nostalgic, remembrances of how they grew up. But the children on the ground, the children who we're supposed to serve, they're saying one thing. This is why I think student voice is so important. This is why community voice is so important, right? So people can share. Well, we had Hillary Beard on Eight Black Hands a while ago, and we talked a lot about how what we didn't get to talk about was her work and conversations with Black families who send their children to private schools. Right. And it's like and she's seeing two things. She tells the story of like two doctors who their children are angry. They put their children in, they moved wherever, have their kids in there, and their kids, as they got older, actually are angry with their parents to say, you did not prepare us for this war, this full-time apparatus to make us feel uncomfortable, this racist, atmosphere that we're in. Yes, we've arrived financially, but we are being waged a war on our intellectual ability, our cultural, our spiritual. Like, we don't have protection. And the parents told Hillary, like, well, we never talked about race. We thought that, the green would protect our Black. and that's problematic. Our kids are saying that ain't the case. That ain't the case at all.
That's got to be heartbreaking for a parent to hear, though, is that you didn't prepare us for the reality here. When in fact, if you're a middle class parent, in a lot of ways, you think that you're shielding your kids from some of those realities by moving out to suburbs, by moving to what you consider to be better neighborhoods that are safer and offer more opportunity, and then putting them in schools that are seen as better than the ones you went to yourself. You feel like you're doing everything right. So it's got to be a little bit heartbreaking to hear from your kids that they're encountering things that weren't part of your program,
Listen, across the country, and I know, in cities like Philadelphia, we're having this whole, removal of the veil of being Black in whatever particular context. Black in, and I shared this before, Black on main line, like it just ripped my heart out, because it, but to hear from that many students talking about, this is what someone told me, this was this racist remark in the classroom, and the teacher just like, ignored it. The teacher heard it. It was like, oh, don't say that. Or just all of these just crazy experiences that you're like, yo, our kids are under assault. Right. And so when you look at what George and Nicholas and Moses and other people like that who were building something to protect their kid, not only educate them, but also protect, and I think it's a real clear distinction and there were some places, and DC was one of them, where, after civil, there was no law to educate Black children. What they took advantage of was that there was no law restricting the education of them either. And so that little crack, there's no law to give us education, but there was no law to restrict it. Oh, that's the crack that we're going to use, and we're going to build something amazing for our children.
I love that point, because one of the things that was different about DC at the time was There wasn't a concerted effort to stop Black people from being educated. As a matter of fact, there was a lot of kind of leniency, whereas other places there was an outright distaste. Even as close as Virginia and other places, there was like a absolute resistance.
They might burn it down, right?
Like they might burn it down.
Yeah.
And DC, for some reason, possibly because it was a federal territory, had more free Black folks, had more white folks that even if they weren't making provisions for your education, they actually were slightly encouraging it. They wanted it to happen in some ways. You had a lot of Congress people there that actually, I read this, which I thought was interesting, that brought with them their most favored enslaved people with them to the Capitol, and they wanted those ones to become educated in ways that they could be useful,
they're like,
to them.
You can make me more money if you can.
Here's something that I found from the Journal of Negro Education that's talking about DC, why DC was special at the time. It says the Negroes have a staff, officials, and teachers of rank and salary scale of the whites. We don't say that much anymore either, do we? The whites. What's going on today? Oh man, the whites. They're basically saying that they had officials, basically infrastructure and teachers. I don't believe this, but this is what they were reporting back then, that were basically on rank and salary scale of the whites. They have their board of examiners, research staff, and Negroes participate not only in the affairs of the colored schools, but in the affairs of the white schools as well.
That's radically different than
other
places. Yeah.
And Doxier Wilkerson, commenting at the time, said there is no other state where Negroes hold administrative position beyond principal and are members of a board of education of public schools. There is a common course of study for all, and equality of opportunity is assured. The Negro in Washington, D.C. today enjoys educational opportunities superior and more diverse than Negroes anywhere in the United States. I mean, that's a big, bold statement. And the lesson that you learn, I think, this is what I take away. You can tell me what you take out of that. Was you had a perfect storm of you weren't being given education, but you weren't being denied education. So it was all up to you. And you didn't do it one way. You did it on your own, with your own money. You did it with white benefactors. You did it with whoever would help. You built your own. You hired your own. You created the system for yourself. And then you demanded administrative autonomy. That was something that comes up in this passage a lot. In the passages in this study often was administrative autonomy, which I've basically just been saying is the thing that led them to want to do equity of resources rather than integration, because they really did want administrative autonomy. They wanted a Black superintendent. They wanted Black teachers. And then, they built public and private. They didn't see a distinction between having private schools and public schools. They had some of these schools, the very first schools actually were in churches, for instance. So this line between private and public or whatnot was something that was sold to us at some point. And Howard University comes out of all this too. This is the other thing. You get Howard out of this, and Howard's what? A private school.
Yep.
Right.
I mean, and that's the thing about it, and I love that you mentioned, it starts so many in church basements, right? Like one of the first schools for Black children in the basement of a church was the start of a school. I think about Nithamu Sasa, the school I attended, right? Started in the basement of a parent, an activist parent's home. And when I look at today and we see like these wealthy folks who are creating pods and whatever to get their child, to keep them academically safe during this pandemic, there are lessons that we can learn. We need our churches, our masajids, those plural for masjids, these large, whoever has space and the willingness and ability, like we need that as well. And we can draw, we don't have to look at look at what the rich white folks are doing. We can say, hey, look at what our ancestors did and use some of those same exact lessons, to move things forward.
I think right now you just hit on something like, what's the spirit from these early Black folks that we can learn from that would be helpful to us right now in something as simple as what you just said, about like white folks right now, which I don't think it's just white folks, to be very honest with you, are creating things like pods, educational pods, because we're in this moment of COVID and you have to do something different. Do you feel like we have as much of the same sense of ingenuity that these folks in the past had?
No. I mean, I think the fire, the dedication, just the singular thought, right? Like the premium that they placed on education, and then care, it talked about like got out of bondage and said, Black children, they need education. Right after the Civil War, it was like, oh, it's still chaos going on. Advance. Amidst the chaos, advance. What's the best way to advance your people? It's through your children. How do we advance our children despite the pandemic? It ties back to education. Advance. I think that's what they had. And I think that other one, they weren't confused. I think, the clarity of thought, right? Like not only we're going to start schools in our basements, right? But we are also going to demand the autonomy, right? That's clarity of thought. Because so many other places, and Chris, you mentioned it. I want to like double down on it. What Chris read it from was that other places, the highest that a Black person could get in the, as far as controlling and supporting the school was the principalship. That was the highest. So that means even as the principal, the superintendent, the folks who are, the supervisor, the principal, the school board, whatever governing factor, they were often, you would not see any Black people there. But in DC, they were like, nah, we're going to flip that. Not only the principal is the lowest level of leadership in this educational ecosystem that we're demanding, right? So that's that other piece.
Well, they wanted governance power.
Exactly.
I mean, these are the type of powers that we're not fighting for right now. They wanted full control over governance power. They wanted control over the purse, over the monies. They wanted control over the curriculum and pedagogy. They wanted administrative autonomy, meaning they wanted to be set aside. Wasn't saying that they were for segregation. They just wanted power. So all these things that we're talking about right now are all flavors of power in education.
And that speaks more to private school, right? Because even if you're a Black-led charter, you still are tied into something, right? And so it just makes me think of, how do we get more, years ago, I would say like, hey, but, Black private schools are getting picked off. Hey, y'all should think about chartering your school. Now, these days I'm thinking like, how do we just get more of everything, but particularly a pathway for more Black private schools, wholly independent and only accountable to the parents of the kids and the community that the kids come from. Like that's, I think, a different ballgame, and it needs to be more, more concretely established in our overall, fight for educational justice, right? Like that piece, I think, when I think about the Black private schools in Philadelphia that ended up closing over the years, how do we reestablish them and also give them the moats of protection from all the arrows that are coming their way for being audacious in their Blackness, audacious in their demand for freedom, and audacious in their demand for autonomy.
I think language might hurt us in this situation. When you think of private, you think of something that is private, that is akin to a small number of people and isn't for everybody. When you think about the schools you just mentioned in Philadelphia, for instance, those were called Black independent schools.
Yeah, absolutely. Independent
Black schools.
Yep.
That's a different language wording because those are for the collective. They're not private necessarily. As a matter of fact, they're public in a way that they're for the Black public, and they're collective. They're collectivist schools. I think private denotes for a lot of people, or connotes, I don't know what denote or connote. One of those, basically says to people that this is for some chosen few, when in fact the Black community was creating its own independent schools. It's autonomous schools.
100% correct. I mean, and that is the language that they used: independent free schools, independent African center schools, independent Black schools. Like those were the ones that we attended, that we celebrate, and that we desperately need today. And this is what I mean. So if we look at this podding of schools or these things, like, can we relaunch these independent Black schools through these pods? What starts off at these, 60th Street Masjid or Enon Baptist Church, like what starts off as these pods to respond to the pandemic, can they then be grown to respond to the endemic racism that has always existed?
Educator Barnes says Black private schools is something I could get behind. She says we need to be less worried about who is creating pods. We need to be more worried about fighting for what we want to do. Ramona Robinson Bishop says reparations. This could be included in the demands made through reparations. California is about to adopt a committee to make recommendations. This could be included. And by this, I think it's the idea that we have our own educational opportunities. I don't know what you would call them in a way now today with our new super integrationist, post-racial, overly educated Negroes who went to too much college way of looking at the world. We might have a problem.
We gotta find out what the tipping point is. Like, all right, that's enough for you. Get back. You're about to be totally inundated with anti-Blackness. Get out.
I mean,
you're at the precipice.
I mean, so what we're not saying about this story. So let me just back up and say, okay, so we're trying to mine history for gems and jewels, for things that could become useful for us today. The Black education story of Washington, D.C. is critical to understanding Black education, period. It was one of the first places where Black administrative power was established in Black education as a rule, as a thing that was part of our agenda. And at some point, we start straying from those things. We start straying from the importance of those. We give up the idea of Black power in education and in schools. And we start thinking about a system, a uniform system of all for everyone. But we do that prematurely. We do that before we have the power, the political or social or economic power to make sure that we get our best out of that. And we give up all our Black educational capital in the process. So it's really a lose-lose deal, right? And for the system, it's a win-win deal. Now they get our kids. They fire our teachers, they fire our principals, they get the per pupil for our kids, and we have no power in the system to make them do anything. We can't determine their work rules. We can't determine their curriculum. We can't have any control over what they do politically because they're bigger than us now. They have all the money. They can override the education. They can override the political systems. They can decide who gets on school boards and who doesn't. They can decide who runs things and who doesn't. So it's a lose-lose deal for all of us to lose these gems of history without analyzing what we're giving up in the process and actually being critical about what we think we're gaining. Like, is it really going to come true? Are we going to have this utopia? Yeah, what's the trade-off? Are we going to have this utopia? Well, here we are in 2020. Are you and I thinking that, what came out of the 1970s in integration and the decapitalization of Black education, how'd that turn out, right? Like, where are we today? We should be super advanced by now today. Right now, today, we're talking about a country where less than a quarter of Black students in fourth grade are on grade level, in things like reading and math. That wasn't supposed to be in 2020, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And actually get your mind around this, Sharif. Tell me what you think about this. We're talking about the ingenuity of Black people at a time where you would think that everything would be terrible. But we're in a time now where we have more organizations than we ever had, more organizations with budgets and infrastructure and staff, more people elected to office, more people voting than ever before. We have Black banks, and we have everything from, I always call it out, Jack and Jill and sororities and sororities, I'm sorry, and fraternities and like,
Ankrum gonna get you.
Yeah, I know. Ankram's gonna be like on me. We have all of this infrastructure and budgets and Negroes in suits going to conferences and leading things and getting on CNN and MSNBC. And we have more than we have ever had in the history, and we can't educate 8 million Black kids.
Exactly.
Help me out, brother. What's going wrong? Like,
I mean, a whole lot. And I think anytime we talk about integration, I think, and you're going to have to say the quote because I don't remember it exactly, but the sentiment was Dr. King says integration is not the way to go if you're going to lose power. He's like, those are two different things, integrating economically or having access is one thing. Don't give up your power. And don't put your children in harm's way. And it's almost like he had, three parts of this particular message of integration, right? He had other messages about militarism, things like that. But around integration, three parts. Don't lose your power. Don't put your children in harm's way. And then access. How is it that we forget the other two and only remember one, and even distort the access thing? Because access to a lot of Black folks meant like, oh, let me go to Macy's and forget about the Black stores and shops and farmers and everyone else who used to, take care of our community. Let's abandon them because it's no way you can be better. So that piece I think is just absolutely crucial. Yeah, thank you.
So he says, I favor integration of buses and in all areas of public accommodation and travel. I am for equality. However, I think integration in our public schools is different. In that setting, you are dealing with one of the most important assets of an individual, the mind. White people view Black people as inferior. A large percentage of them have a very low opinion of our race. People with such a low view of the Black race cannot be given free rein and put in charge of the intellectual care and development of our boys and girls. This is Martin Luther King Jr. talking.
Listen, the crazy part is that, that reading that, right? If you don't know better, you start thinking like Trump, like what? Frederick Douglass around the corner, invite him over. Like, wait, but Dr. King wrote that this morning at dawn. Like he wrote that this morning, right? Because it's 2020. And who can't say something like that right now about the Black experience in our schools?
Well, I would ask you if you read this passage, this quote, and ask yourself, okay, but is it different now than it was when he said this? Listen, like, did the world move on?
Recent research says that as early as 3 and 4 years old, Black children experience racial biases from who? Not the cops, not the judge. These are 3 or 4 year olds. From the person leading the classroom. That's recent research.
Someone's asking for the link to this quote, which I think is great, because anytime we share this quote with anyone, people are kind of astounded and they want to do their gut checking, their fact checking on it to make sure that this brother said what we're saying he said, which I think is good. Check your resources and your stories. Where I will say it's important to know about this quote, and people who are for integration and are Negroes with too much college that don't want to talk about the reals of integration as a strategy for Black people, do not, they actually ignore this constantly. They ignore the idea that even people within the movement actually were disagreeing with integration as a main strategy. I just want to keep talking clear. This isn't some latter day Black nationalist stuff. This is the bottom line strategy. They weren't thinking it was smart to give up your teachers, your principals, your schools, your buildings, your control over the pedagogical process. But it should be noted that Dr. King said this while he was a reverend, and he was about to leave for national prominence. He was visited by 2 Black educators who were both a husband and wife team who were high school teachers. And they were having a conversation with him about integration, about the schools, about the concerns that Black educators were having with the idea of what would happen if we integrated and they lost power. And this is what he said to them. This is what he said to 2 of his parishioners about integration. He's all for it for buses and hotels and restaurants and schools and whatnot. But when it came to the intellectual care and development of boys and girls, that's where he broke with it as a main legal strategy. We have to keep thinking about that right now. Who owns the intellectual care and development of our Black boys and girls right now?
Absolutely. And this mindset, and this is why I spend so much time, developing educators and those adjacent to schools through our organization around the mindset, like it was mindset, skill, and will. When you're educating any child, but particularly Black children who are already subjected to we hate you messages from the media, we hate you messages from society, and we hate you messages from their schools, right? And so, we often talk about Malcolm X asks, who told you to hate yourself? For too many Black children, like, my school taught me. My school taught me to hate myself. Yeah, like that's from early on, as early as 3 and 4 years old. Like that's what I learned. And so I think, we have to understand Dr. King, and in particular, I love that he was saying this to 2 Black educators.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like that to me, like when you talk about like, you know, just the purity of thought and this one-on-one conversation about like, hey, here's what you need to know. I'm fighting this grand battle on a national stage, but in our war room, take note of this and don't let it go. We let it go.
Why do you think we let it go?
I think a lot of times we're seduced by seduced by the idea like, oh, as you always say, white ice is colder. What do you say? White water is wetter. I don't know what you say. It's something snarky and funny, but you know, like that idea, like it has to be better.
Mm-hmm.
You know, where there were enslaved Black people on plantations who would tell their children, we're actually smarter than they have the power. We're actually smarter than them. We're actually higher intellectually. We're at a higher level morally. We're at a higher level spiritually than our oppressor. But then some kind of way it got flipped and just like the oppressor is actually smarter than us. That's where we lost our way. And I don't think it was a singular, you know, axis where it happened. I think it was, you know, a thousand cuts. That ship, remember we talked about leaving the harbor. One changes, you know, 2-3 degrees. 50 years later, those ships are at very different places just from that small degree. So I think that's what just kept adding up. And now we think our oppressor is smarter than us and know better how to educate our kids.
I actually think it was once we turned our kids over, they started being trained with that idea. And then they created a generation of people who didn't have the former consciousness, but who still considered themselves the success stories. Right.
Yeah.
So now you have Negropeans and near Negroes actually giving speeches where they attribute all of their success in life to having gone to a mostly white school where there were few Black kids. And I'm not going to name names, but you know, there are people on the lighter spectrum, such as myself, who, unlike me, though, will say that everything that they have is the result of them having not gone to Black schools, right?
And then you flip that to Dunbar and the graduates and the history that was shown there, and you say, like, really? They have something to say about that. Our ancestors have something to say about that.
I had a national expert when the Dunbar thing came up in a conversation with us, a national near Black person say to me, Dunbar was an exception. Dunbar is not a rule. You can pull out as many Black examples as you want to, but everybody knows that those are outliers of Black education history, and you're never going to get anywhere by pulling out the outliers. In the main, integration is the thing. So talking about exceptional Black schools in history is not really the thing to do.
Yeah, no, I understand. And you know, when I've had conversations similar to that, you know, with people, when I talk about Neta Musasa, or when I talk about, you know, other schools, you know, Marcus Garvey Shule and Uhuru Sasa, and like, you know, like these exceptionalities, you keep stringing them together like you do any other victory, and then you build, right? That's the whole point. You piloting things, you have these institutions, and you keep building on the success. You don't say, oh, this was great, let's abandon that because it was, you know, let's abandon it. Other people do the exact opposite. Oh, that works. Oh, we're going to build this for, you know, forever. We're going to forever build on this.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, it's all in the way that what you take from the story.
Exactly.
And if you take from it, oh yeah, but that was, you know, rare. The real story is more negative than that. That leads you down one path. And if you think, oh wow, we built schools before, and actually, to tell you the truth, we didn't stop building schools. Now, what we didn't talk about in this history that we're giving and that we're talking about of DC public schools, we talked about their particularly important role within Black education history and the potential for it guiding strategy today. What we didn't talk about is all of this unwinds at some point.
Yeah.
Right? Dunbar unwinds at some point. The control of Black people over Black education in DC unwinds at some point. DC goes through a period where it had something, and anyone correct me, please, but it was like a chancellor a year for like a decade or something, like 10 different chancellors in 13 years or something like that.
Yeah.
And you get to a point in time where you have Michelle Rhee come along and she's just like, we're gonna have to like redo a whole bunch of stuff here, and then she's fought by the Black community, ginned on by the teachers union, led by a Black man who has since recanted all of that organizing that they did against reform.
We should have him on one day.
We really should. We should have him and Kaya Henderson on.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Because Kaya to me represents an echo of our DC ancestors. And I don't mean that she's from there. I just mean that when she came into her role and in prominence in the role, she was listening to the echoes of the past of our greatness and our excellence. And she was unearthing some of these gems as part of her educational strategy in the city.
Mm-hmm. The mindset, right? Like when you talk to her and you see, not only just talk, because it goes beyond talk, when you see like what she was trying to do, what she accomplished, what she was doing in DC, it speaks to this idea, like, you know what, sis believes in Black children.
Yeah.
Sis believes in the Black community, right? Like
what a radical thought.
Exactly. Right.
And so you know what, it led her to do certain things too, like she formed a partnership. I don't know ever what happened to it with Urban Prep in Chicago and Howard University, I believe it was, to create kind of like a K-12 HBCU pipeline. I haven't seen that like tried anywhere else in the country, right? Like the idea that you could create a Black pipeline to excellence with what you have, before you, a successful charter school, a successful private. Howard is private. I got to keep mentioning people as we talk about, oh my God, we don't want no privatization. There's nothing weirder than talking to somebody who graduated from Morehouse, Spelman, or Howard who tells you we don't need no privatization of education for Black folks. And it's kind of like, Now you do know that listen, HBCU went was private, right?
Listen, this is why Malcolm said, no matter what you study history too. Like you got Howard, graduates who didn't know that it was actually founded by a white person, right? And so they were just like, no, we don't need one. Like actually a white person founded Howard University. I want you to understand. They're like, what? Some of them go crazy because they just can't, understand like there's more complexity than what you just assume or what you tweet about or what you chant about. Like let's dive in. Actual building blueprints takes more heft than that, takes more intellectual heft than just, the rhetoric. And I love rhetoric, but, it can't stop at rhetoric. Behind the rhetoric has to be some actual building happening, as Thomas Sankara said, our revolution ain't for the pretty slogans. Too many of us think the revolution is a bunch of fine slogans. Thomas Sankara said, nah, that ain't what this is about. It ain't about pretty words. This is about work.
Well, I don't think everybody knows that. So what are your final words, man? We're wrapping up now. What are your final words on what we talked about today?
Yeah, I think, my final words would really center the history of Black education. And in particular, if you look at it through a prism at a magnifying glass of DC. And how, as you mentioned, and you're doing Howard, like how that was born out of this work. A Black school that was founded by a white woman who used to teach Black and brown children in the Northeast Massachusetts or wherever, New England, came down to the South, Mississippi, and they were like, nah, we'll kill them if you teach. She's like, can I teach the Black children that I see down? They're right down the street. Like where I hear them being beat while I'm teaching these the plantation owners' children. Can we teach them they were like, we will kill them if you teach them. She ended up, where did she go? DC. Right. And so DC was this area. I think her name was Mary or Mary Milner or something to that effect. I'll put it in the chat later. But she started school for Black children, hired Black teachers, and that eventually became the University of Washington, D.C. Right. And so this long thought. So how do we use right now the chaos that's happening? How do we advance through the chaos? Because no matter how terrible it is right now, it ain't as bad as it was in 1870. So yes, the context is different. The times are different. What can we learn from our ancestors? They're whispering it to us. They've shouted it to us. When will we take heed and build on what they showed us?
Mm. I think it's a great place to stop. The only reason we look to history is because it's what did they show us and what did they tell us and how can it inform today to make today better than it was yesterday. What I learned from DC, I think in this story and looking at the background that I had to look at for us to talk about this today, I see a few things. First of all, there was a general spirit is of if you give us anything, we'll take it and make good out of it. If you give us the space to create education, we'll make the space produce something. If you give us a school, if you give us a leader, but the things that they fought for that were important were governance. They wanted to be in control. They wanted resources, and they wanted the apparatus to be fully responsive to themselves. They wanted to be in lead of the educational leadership, the teaching, the pedagogical leadership, and they wanted it to be for and by Black people because they knew that there was power in that. They knew that there was power. That's where the power was. We've lost that. We transitioned at some point from that as being the story. I'm going to wrap here. A couple of things like the belief gap didn't exist. Right. We have a belief gap right now. We actually don't believe that Black kids can learn, which is ironic because we're in one of the most Black capitalized times in our history ever. And we have the least belief in the fact that our kids can learn versus back then. So I think we need to get back to the idea that it doesn't need to be public or private. It could be both. It doesn't need to be without, the broader community, because a lot of these educators back then were forming alliances with white people with resources to make it happen. But the relationship was different back then. They wanted the resource and they had a proper role for white people to play. Fund it, don't run it, right? Fund us, don't run us is kind of like a lesson that we didn't learn. Like, you can do good by sending us the resources we ask for. If we need a teacher, we'll ask you for one, and then send it because we're asking you for teachers. And they did that. The Quakers did it, and others. We need money. We need buildings. We need political cover. We need help when the politicians are trying to kill us. But let us drive all of that. All things that I think were washed from our hard drive and our mental capacity in the 1970s during integration time, where we started producing a bumper crop of Negroes who associated all of their power with turning their power over to a white educational establishment, not in running their own. And we're working desperately now to think through, how do we recover like what we had in the past? I'm sorry, brother. I saw you were going to say something, so jump in.
No. What I was going to say when you were talking about was people freaked out. Even I heard that Clinton freaked out. Maybe as flashback. Stokely Carmichael was at a speech, and he wasn't the first one to say it, but was talking about Black power, right? Our ancestors, particularly around education, DC is an example of that. That's what they were saying. That's what they were saying. So people took exception to Stokely Carmichael saying it at a rally and things like that. But the folks, Dr. King said it to those educators, part of his congregation. The folks who George Bell and his comrades said it, right? And the folks who fought in DC to ensure that it wasn't just the principle, but it was the governance structure was going to be Black people. What they were saying was, get the power and don't let it go, because that's how you protect your children culturally, intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. If you don't have power, you're not protecting anything. It's the power that protects your most prized components of your community. That's our children. That's our children.
Power. That's what we should all be fighting for. Well, thank you again, Sharif, for another enlightening Freedom Friday. I appreciate you as always. It's one of my favorite days of the week. Yeah, one of my favorite discussions every week. For everybody watching and listening, I say it to you every day, but today I'm going to say it to you even double. Thank you. Thank you for watching, for listening, for adding so much, for making these days worthwhile to do these on Freedom Fridays. Appreciate you all. I think my main lesson out of all this is, if you don't own education, you don't own yourself. And right now we don't own ourselves, right? Because we don't own education. We don't own the intellectual care and development of our boys and girls, our girls and boys, our children. And that is one of our main problems. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching, for